So, Rachel, you've got the first question submitted by a listener called Yatsik. I think that's how you pronounce it, which we've been meaning to get to for a while, actually, because we thought it was a good question, but we haven't managed to fit it in yet. So what's he asking?
So he asks, I would be interested to hear the panel's take on Keir Starmer's what he calls xenophobic comparison between the UK's and Poland's economy. There are a lot of different angles to tackle the Tories from without alienating people from Central Europe. I saw that David Lammy was using Romania as well as a comparison.
So we thought this was a good question, and just in case any of our listeners missed it, this is in reference to the fact Labour likes to cite that the UK is on course to be $600 poorer per person than Poland in 2030. And so Keir Starmer has made that point in a City of London speech and also at PMQs, and David Lammy has said something similar about the UK set to be poorer than Romania by 2040. And actually, Daniel Kaczynski, who's a Conservative MP with Polish heritage, who heads the APPG on Poland, wrote to Starmer to ask him to stop making the comparison because he said it borders on racism and shows a lack of respect to sort of how successful Poland has been. So what do you think of using this comparison? It does sometimes jar, actually, when I hear it from Labour figures.
I don't understand on what basis it would be xenophobic to point out that Poland's doing very, very well. Once upon a time, they weren't doing as well as our economy, and now they're not. I mean, I can understand this former Eastern Bloc kind of country, but I don't see why kind of making that kind of comparison to sort of try and shed light on where the UK is really is a xenophobic statement in and of itself.
I think there's sort of two aspects to it. You've got the statement of fact that Poland, I think it's by the end of the 20s, is set, given their current growth rates, to have a higher GDP per capita than the UK. Now, it depends on how it's said, whether there's a sneering tone to it, which basically says that we don't want to be like these people, so therefore we need to try harder. So why are you suggesting that it's so bad to be like these people? I think that's sort of the crux of the issue. And I think if you look at Poland's economy in general, I mean, they've grown so much since the 90s. They were one of the only countries not to suffer GDP decline during the financial crisis, and they're growing at 3.5% in the past decade, whereas I think we've averaged about 0.5. So it's tricky. I think it very much comes down to the tone. You can't just say something xenophobic simply because they're making a comparison between countries. It's as you say, Anoosh, it can be sometimes jarring when you hear that, because there's that underlying tone of, well, we would never want to be like them, therefore we need to do something different.
I think that's the thing. There's an assumption underneath making points like this, which is this country ought to be poorer than we are. And actually, perhaps to argue sort of in favour of Labour, perhaps it's reasonable to expect the UK to be doing better than Poland, because Poland, we know in our recent history that a lot of Polish people came here to work, particularly sort of because of the EU allowing them to do so. I think it's one of the biggest diasporas in the UK. And so, that would suggest that it is, a country that has in the recent past, sort of been less economically prosperous than the UK. So perhaps it's a fair thing to say in that sense. But to me, it does sound... I often cringe slightly at the comparison because, why on earth should Poland be doing any worse than the UK now when, like you say, it's had success with building its growth?
Why shouldn't it be doing well? Quite. But I think there is a sort of, I guess what Labour was trying to get at with this is that, as you say, a lot of Polish people probably found the UK very aspirational to come to, and the situation might be slightly different now, but I just don't see how it's xenophobic. I kind of think pointing to it as xenophobic kind of feels a bit xenophobic, because it's like, why shouldn't Poland be doing well, and why do people view them? For sure. Why do people view it that way? I just don't get the premise of it, really. But
the bald facts really are quite awkward for the government in any case. I remember there was an FT piece a while ago, which I think the headline was something like, Britain is now a poor society just with some very rich people in it. Yeah. And it made some of these comparisons that the average Slovenian household will be better off than its British counterpart by 2024. Now, obviously, Slovenia's economy is far, far smaller than that of the UK. It shouldn't really be a comparison, and that's not to be xenophobic. That is just, by rankings of GDP, it is just so much smaller. Whereas we're supposed to be one of the richest countries in Europe. So I do think a contrast like that really did stand out. I remember it caught a lot of people's imagination at the time.
We had the same with the Italy comparison as well. I think it's when The Economist had Italy, we're going to be poorer than Italy. Brittany, on their cover, and that instigated a lot of criticism, because people were saying, well, what's wrong with Italy? So that's a similar point.
Yeah.
There's also just a broader point that there's this kind of like a useless comparison in some ways, because it's like, you know, I mean, we have different economies in terms of the mix of the economy for a start, but also like, what are their green targets like? How, you know, do they have a very green economy? How sort of equally is growth being spread? That kind of question is something that can kind of backfire if you want to go down this path in politics. So yeah.
And the crux of it is that we've not been growing. Our economy is not doing very well. So that's the key point I think the politicians are trying to convey.
Yes, exactly. And what struck me during this conversation, actually, just as a final point, is these kind of facts do undermine the argument that people often make in terms of immigration. So, you know, when some politicians argue that actually it's immoral to take so many workers from certain countries because it impoverishes those countries, clearly hasn't happened in Poland or Romania or some of the other Eastern European countries that are mentioned in these comparisons, which is interesting. Thanks so much for watching. We'd love to know what you think. Please make sure you leave your comments below. And if you enjoyed watching this podcast, you can watch more of our videos on our YouTube channel. And don't forget to like and subscribe.